So what is Quaker Simplicity? Simplicity is one of the testimonies of Quakerism. The testimony to simplicity is a shorthand description of the actions generally taken by members of the Religious Society of Friends or Quakers, to testify or bear witness to their beliefs that a person ought to live a simple life in order to focus on what is most important and ignore or minimize what is least important. And the word testimony in this context describes the way that they testify or bear witness to their beliefs in everyday life. So testimony doesn't mean belief itself, it is the committed action arising out of their religious experience. So they are enacting it every day in their lives, it's not just a theoretical belief. Testimony to simplicity includes the practice among Quakers of being more concerned with one's inner condition than one's outward appearance, and more concerned with other people than oneself. And when applied to clothing, this translates the Quaker idea of plainness, in which one did not adorn one's clothes excessively in embroidery, in ruffles, in ruching, in excess. And they didn't wear very bright colours. They dressed quite modestly. This is talking about historical Quakers here. And they were interested in displaying their faith through looking inwards rather than these kind of outward fashions. They also didn't ascribe to changing fashions, so they didn't ascribe to this sort of throwaway culture where you would change over your clothes to the latest fashion, which still did exist to some extent in the 17th to 19th centuries. But instead, they were often 20 years behind in fashion. Their clothing changed quite slowly. Quaker simplicity, however, has evolved somewhat within modern Quakerism. Around the turn of the 20th century, they stopped dressing in what people normally associate with Quaker dress. The clothing that's quite similar to Mennonites or the Amish, it's quite instantly recognizable. And instead, they sought to incorporate the idea of plainness by avoiding fast fashion, designer labels, and avoiding swapping over their clothes too often or having them be a huge concern and part of their life. Quaker bonnets were actually often really a lot simpler than their general equivalents. So there weren't any added embroidery, there wasn't any extra ruching, it was just really, really simple. And this is a beautiful example of that. This pristine black silk bonnet has very, very little in the way of embellishment. It just has this section at the back, which was pretty standard for a Quaker bonnet of the 19th century. And we know that this belonged to quite a wealthy Quaker woman because of the absolutely beautiful quality of the silk. And it's actually preserved extremely well. It's not shattering at all, which is something that's quite common in silks of this age. And so this was probably worn only for best by a wealthy Quaker woman, but as you can see, wealth meant black dye, it meant high quality silks, it didn't mean embellishment, because they were still trying to attest to that Quaker simplicity, to that plainness of style. So I pulled this bonnet because it's an example of something that's probably more on the edge of how fancy a Quaker bonnet could be. And as you can see, it's not in black or brown or a drab colour. It's in this sort of mauvey grey, but again, nothing too garish. It has some sort of ruffled texture along here and along the back edge. So it has a little bit more adornment than you would usually expect. But it's done in this beautiful basket work, which gives it some character and it gives it some embellishment without actually being beading or ruffles or something that wouldn't be plain. So this is probably about as fancy as you would get with, again, silk here. From the inception of Quakerism in the 17th century to about the turn of the 20th century, Quaker women would have worn a day bonnet. So this is an example of a day bonnet. You would have worn it in your house and among friends over your hair as a way to sort of display your plainness, and that was tied up with the concept of modesty. And then you would, if you were going out, put your main bonnet, which we saw earlier, over the top of this. It would also help preserve your hair and from the elements. This example is quite lovely. It's got a sort of squared muslin fabric, and then this lace around the edge. You have a single lace brim, and then along the bottom edge, and remember this would have been poking out from under your over bonnet, you would have a double ruffle around the back. So this is a little bit fancier for what you would expect, and there are definitely women who chose plainer versions, so be more in keeping with the plainness idea. But some women chose to, and it was still okay, to have something a little bit more embellished in terms of lace. So this is a cotton underbonnet. This would have gone underneath your bonnet when you went out. It's got a sort of quatrefoil design and two bands, one along the middle of the head and one along the front. So the words day bonnet or cap and underbonnet can sometimes be used interchangeably, and in fact their function was sometimes interchangeable, but there is a subtle technical difference. The cap or the day bonnet would have been worn as a separate item inside, and sometimes the underbonnet would be going under your outside bonnet, and that could be dedicated to that purpose. If it was going under your outer bonnet, it could be a lot plainer on the cap, which would not be visible, and then a lot more decorated along the outer edge and along the neckline where it was visible. As you can see, however, with this example, even though it's going underneath your outside bonnet, the material has this little quatrefoil design on it, so this is a fancier underbonnet. So this is an example of a really plain cap. It's for a baby, as you can see, it's very small, and it's just made of a very, very fine muslin, and it's edged along the front, and it has a drawstring to accommodate a growing head size, which babies' heads obviously grow quite fast, and some very plain straps. And this would have been very similar to the style of an adult bonnet, underbonnet, that was very plain for perhaps the more conservative Quaker woman. This is a day cap or a day bonnet, which was made for a descendant of Elizabeth Fry as a costume, and it's quite an interesting choice because it is the exact reproduction of, or it's meant to be an exact reproduction of this bonnet in this image of Elizabeth Fry here. So she's dressed fairly modestly here. You can see she has the crisscross fichu, her shawl, and the dark long dress, and here is that same bonnet. So, as you can imagine, you would need a warmer day bonnet for if you were going out in winter to if you were going out in summer, otherwise you would get really quite hot. So this example here, you've got a much thicker fabric, which is double thickness around the bottom, and so that would have been much more for winter or autumn use, whereas this one here, which is the imitation Elizabeth Fry one, is of a very, very fine sort of muslin cloth, and that would have been more for summer use. Now, we actually have quite a few examples in the collection of actually net day bonnets or underbonnets, which would go under your main bonnet, and the net would increase its breathability, so it did have its function as a sort of modest cap and a lining between your hair and the bonnet, but it also allowed you to breathe in summer so you didn't get all hot and sweaty and horrible. So early Quaker women tended to wear shawls over their dresses and clothes, partly for modesty reasons, but also partly because in a time before coats, shawls were normally the way of keeping warm in the winter when you went out. And I've picked this example because although normally shawls were cream or black or brown, you can see this one has a bit of colour to it. It's a sort of mauve, purpley colour. And although it is colourful, it is quite muted, which was typical where you did see colour. You didn't have bright colours. But the attention to detail with these fringe areas is really quite exquisite. And that didn't defy sort of the idea of simplicity. It could be a way of adding a little bit of more interest to your clothing without sort of leaving your beliefs behind, without breaking that testimony to plain dress. And this again is a very high quality item. It's silk, and it's not shattering again. So this would have been a prized possession, and it would have probably been only worn on special occasions or maybe on Sundays. So early Quaker women would wear a fichu, and a fichu was a square or triangle of cloth that was then folded around the neck and tucked in, or sometimes buttoned or tied in to the front of the dress, and it provided neck coverage, it provided warmth, and it also was related to the idea of modesty and plainness. So don't worry, this is not part of the collection, this is a reproduction. I'm just going to show you what that would look like. So this is your square of cloth, and this one is actually quite warm. It's a sort of wool substance. And you would fold it in half into a triangle and then put it around your neck and tuck it over. So this would either be tucked into the front of your dress, sometimes it was fastened with a brooch in the centre, sometimes it was tied into the front, and at other times you would actually cross it over, so it provided a full coverage of the front and back of your neck. So here we have two examples from our own collection. We have this really thin muslin with a lovely edge to it with little stripes on. And at one corner we actually have a loop, and that would have fastened onto a button down the front of the dress to secure it so it didn't come loose. As you can see, it's actually a very wafty fabric, so it would have easily slipped otherwise. And this one, instead of being in a square, is actually in a triangle shape, as you can see. So this is very lightweight. It would have been for summer use. Whereas this one here is of a much heavier design. It's silk. It has these vertical lines in the fabric, and it's a much heavier material. So this would have been much more suited to shoulder seasons or winter wear. And again, this one is actually a triangle. Also, if you didn't want to wear a fichu, there were a few other types of neck covering, and this is one of them. What at first glance looks like a small child's shirt is actually a collar, which is similar to a fichu, but in this case it has buttons on the front and then ties that come round the waist, and you would pull these ties around your waist and fasten it in place. This one has obviously been quite well used, as it's in quite a fragile condition, has a few bits of foxing, which is this orange discoloration, but that just adds to its history. So we have quite a lot less men's clothing than women's in the collection, and this reflects a general trend that a lot less men's clothing survived. This is an example of a man's shirt. You have the ruffled collar. This is from the 18th century. You have quite long, loose sleeves, which, although beautifully hand-stitched and hand-finished, of course, pre-sewing machines, it doesn't have any extra adornment other than that plain neck ruffle. But one of the most interesting things about this particular piece is that it has been quite roughly torn off at the bottom edge. And this tells a story of the sort of reason that we don't have very much in the way of men's clothing, is that when men's clothing wore out, it was often shredded into rags and used as cleaning cloths. So we don't have those survivals, and it's quite likely that what happened to this shirt is the bottom was removed at some point when the family ran out of rags. The kind of clothing that tends to survive a lot better are things like baby clothes, which were often kept for sentimental reasons and reused for multiple children, and also things like wedding dresses and bonnets, which were used for Sunday best. So the silk bonnets, the black bonnets, and the wedding dresses. Even if the wedding dress wasn't specifically made for the wedding, even if it was the best dress, it wouldn't have been worn very often. And even if it was made specifically for the wedding, it would then have been reused on special occasions, cared for, kept nice, and not worn too often. So we can see here that we have two baby gowns, and I'm going to use them to illustrate an interesting point. From what we've seen before, embroidery could be an exception to the idea of everything needing to be plain and simple, and more specifically embroidery of things like cotton and muslin and plain cloth. So here you can see a baby gown that was pleated a little bit. It had a bit of rope-like embroidery, and on the back some embroidery on glaze, which is where elements of the design are actually cut out, and you would embroider around those holes and around it in a sort of raised pattern. In this case, it's a sort of leafy pattern that was quite common. You could also have floral patterns with that. But in this case, it's even more elaborate, and you have all of this lace work up at the top. You have lace at the ends of the ties, and you also have a beautiful lace edging at the bottom of the gown. So this obviously comes within the limits of what was generally acceptable for simplicity, for plainness, but you can see here that that did actually include a lot of individual and also regional variation. These Quakers who owned this, who made this, clearly didn't have such an extreme view of the idea of plainness and simplicity. So what we've seen before is that certain items, so silk items, things like bonnets, outer bonnets that is, and dresses were often not embroidered. Those were very rarely adorned and embroidered, but things made out of cotton often did have more of an edging. And you will see in the display case below this that there are a pair of sleeves from different sets that both have lace cuffs, but they are again on a cotton sleeve, on a white sleeve. So it can be quite difficult to envisage how all of these pieces of clothing came together and what that actually looked like in practice. So we have a couple of photographs. This one is of Rebecca O'Brien from November 1890, and this was coming towards the end of the time in which Quakers still adhered very rigidly to that idea of plain dress. And you can see that she's got a bonnet which is tied under her chin. She has a veil coming off it, which is another item that was sometimes worn, especially in mourning. And she's got a shawl over the top of her dress and a long dress. You can't see her fichu because it's covered, but she'll be wearing one of those as well. So this is another photograph. This is showing Ellen Fry and Jane Pollard. It came out of The Cupola, which is the Ackworth school magazine, but we don't have a date for this, although it will be in the 19th century. You can see that both these women are wearing their day bonnets. They're not wearing an outer bonnet, with the ruff around the face and head. They're also wearing a fichu. You can see the fichu in these photographs. And they're wearing longer shawls, so again, probably quite cold in the winter, and something you want to warm up with. And you can also see their full-length dresses. Although you can't see the colouring in any of these photos, they would have been wearing either brown, black, cream, white, as you would expect, or sort of more drab versions of the colours, so a plum, a mauve, a grey, sometimes a sort of dark green, sort of washed out colours, not bright colours. And as we saw before, this one is Elizabeth Fry with her day bonnet. Again, she has a fichu, a shawl, and a long dress. In the early days of Quakerism, there was a little bit of contention about what counted as simplicity. So plainness, or what counted as plainness. And plainness was considered very important. So we have the minutes of a national meeting held in Dublin, Ireland, which was in 1699. And this is clearly quite a topic of contention. People aren't adhering to these guidelines that the meeting has put forth, and they've got some advice on it. Friends are therefore desired to wear them after a plain manner, which best becomes truth, and not to go on with their bosoms open and their fine stays or stomachers to be seen. White frocks made of very fine cloth with broad double hems, very white shoes with red heels, very fine white aprons with a great show. All these things are judged by this meeting not constant with the plainness of truth. So you can see here a thread which was quite common in Ireland and among Irish Quakers at this time, which was the idea that a bright bleached white, in this case in an apron, was not appropriate. This wasn't plain enough. It needed to be of a natural or drab colouring. But on the other hand, Margaret Fell later married George Fox and became Margaret Fox, who did imbue quite a lot of importance to the concept of plainness, nevertheless criticised the ways in which this idea was being implemented at the time. We are now coming into that which Christ cried woe against, minding altogether outward things, neglecting the inward work of Almighty God in our hearts. If we can but frame according to outward prescriptions and orders, and deny eating and drinking with our neighbours, in so much that poor friends is mangled in their minds, that they know not what to do. For one's friend says one way, and another another. But Christ Jesus saith that we must take no thought what we shall eat, or what we shall drink, or what we shall put on, but bids us consider the lilies how they grow, in more royalty than Solomon. But contrary to this, we must look at no colours, nor make anything that is changeable colours as the hills are, nor sell them, nor wear them, but we must be in all one dress and one colour. This is a silly poor gospel. It is more fit for us to be covered with God's eternal spirit and clothed with his eternal light, which leads us and guides us into righteousness. So what Margaret Fox was saying is that there was too much obsession over the idea of a lack of colour and too much obsession over the enactment of plainness in one's dress outwardly, rather than looking inwardly to make sure that they were actually following the testimony of plainness and focusing back on the religious aspect rather than the outward aspect. And she's criticising the idea that the colours of nature shouldn't be worn, the colours of nature, the bright colours of the hills aren't to be worn. She actually stood against that idea.